On May 23, 2022, a crane pulled a payphone off the sidewalk at 7th Avenue and West 50th Street in Manhattan and set it on a flatbed truck. City officials stood on the curb and watched it go. It was the last public payphone in New York City. That was 2022. 2 decades earlier, there were more than 2 million of them standing across the United States. The payphone was the one piece of American infrastructure that worked for anybody holding a coin. If you're someone who values things that were built to work for everyone, subscribe for more stories like this. And 133 years before that crane, the whole thing started with one man in Hartford, Connecticut. His name was William Gray, and he was a mechanic and an inventor. He had already patented an inflatable chest protector for baseball catchers. On August 13, 1889, the United States Patent Office granted him patent number 408,709 for a coin-controlled apparatus for telephones. That same year, the Southern New England Telephone Company installed the first one inside a bank in Hartford, Connecticut. Public telephones already existed before that. The Connecticut Telephone Company is reported to have kept one in its New Haven office beginning June 1, 1880. But a clerk sat next to it and took the money by hand, and somebody had to be paid to stand there all day. That is the problem Gray's box solved. It collected the fare with nobody watching. Gray's machine was a post-pay device. You placed the call first, then dropped your coins in afterward, and a set of small bells inside the housing rang at different pitches. A nickel rang one way, a dime rang another. The operator on the far end of the line listened, counted the money by ear, and released the connection. In 1898, the prepay version arrived in Chicago, the one where the money goes in first. That is the machine most of the country would use for the next 100 years. In 1891, Gray founded the Gray Telephone Pay Station Company to put the machines everywhere he could. He was not selling telephones. He was selling access to one, to people who would never own a telephone of their own. That distinction runs through the entire century that follows. The reason the payphone worked so well for the better part of 100 years is that it was barely a machine. It was a terminal on the end of a line the Bell system controlled from a building miles away. Bell called it a coin line. The box on the wall did almost no thinking. When you dropped a quarter, the coin fell past a set of chimes, and the sound of those chimes traveled down the copper pair to equipment in the central office. In the early decades, a human operator listened for those tones. Later, an automated coin toll system listened instead. Either way, the decision was made at the other end of the wire. The central office decided whether you had paid, whether to connect you, whether to refund you, and whether to keep the coin. The payphone itself was a steel lockbox with a microphone in it. That design is why the thing was so hard to kill. The copper pair carried its own power, fed from the central office, which ran on batteries and backup generators of its own. When the power went out on your block, the payphone kept working. It needed no battery, no charger, no tower, no signal, and no account in your name. It needed a coin. That is why, on September 11, 2001, and again after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when cellular networks in the affected areas jammed or went dark, lines formed at payphones. In the days right after Katrina, they were reported to be among the only working means of communication in parts of the Gulf Coast. What comes next is the part that still doesn't quite make sense. The more reliable the payphone became, the less anyone wanted to pay to keep it standing. For most of the 20th century, the call stayed close to free. A local call ran about 2 cents in the late 1920s and a nickel through the 30s. In the 1960s, it went to 10 cents. Through the late 70s and into the early 80s, it drifted up toward 20 cents. And in December of 1981, the Bell system began pushing 25 cents as a national rate. At those prices, the payphone was not really a standalone business. It was closer to a public utility with a coin slot in it. The phones on the poorest corners did not earn their keep, and the phone companies installed them anyway, because the rest of the telephone monopoly carried them. That is not an interpretation. Congress would later write the elimination of those subsidies directly into federal law, which tells you exactly what was there to eliminate. By 1999, the network had reached its full size. The Federal Communications Commission put the count at more than 2.1 million payphones in service. The industry's own trade group has cited a higher figure, roughly 2.6 million in the mid-1990s. and the sources disagree on where the true peak sits. What is not in dispute is the money. Payphone service in the United States brought in roughly $2.5 billion in 1999. There were payphones in bus stations, hospital corridors, gas stations, school hallways, hotel lobbies, and on the corner of almost every street that had a corner. Then two decisions, 12 years apart, took the floor out from under all of it. The first was structural. On January 1st, 1984, the Bell system was broken up under a consent decree overseen by Judge Harold Green of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The local operating companies were split into 7 regional companies. One consequence of that breakup was that payphones no longer had to belong to the phone company. Independent operators could buy a phone, install it, and run it as a private business. Those units were called customer-owned coin-operated telephones. They spread through the 80s and 90s, and they came with a new logic. A payphone now had to justify itself on its own revenue. The second decision finished the job. Section 276 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 ordered the local phone companies to terminate their payphone subsidies within a year of the rules taking effect, and required the FCC to build a system paying payphone owners for every completed call. The stated goal was more payphones, not fewer. Congress and the Commission believed that removing the subsidy and letting the market set the price would draw in competitors and expand the network. The Commission also deregulated the local coin rate, on the reasoning that the marketplace should set the price of a call. That is the pivot of this entire story, and it has a statute number and a date attached to it. Here's what it meant on the sidewalk. Freed from the old caps, the price of a local call went from 25 cents to about 35 cents in the late 90s. By the middle of 2001, it had reached 50 cents across most of the country. The call doubled in price at the exact moment a competing product was arriving in every pocket in America, and the promised compensation system turned into a decade of litigation. Long-distance carriers were supposed to pay payphone owners for calls placed with calling cards and toll-free numbers, the ones where no coin ever dropped. Tracking those calls was difficult, and collecting on them was harder. The FCC set an early default rate of 35 cents per call, later lowered it to 24 cents, and on August 12, 2004, raised it to 49.4 cents, based on cost evidence filed by the payphone providers and the long-distance carriers. The rate went up. The calls did not come back. By then, the outcome was visible in the balance sheets, and AT&T and Verizon made their choice. On December 3, 2007, AT&T announced it would leave the payphone business entirely by the end of 2008. It put roughly 65,000 phones across its original 13-state territory up for sale, and said the ones it could not sell would be pulled out. The company that had built the network walked away from it inside 1 calendar year. Verizon followed. In October of 2011, it sold its remaining payphone operation, roughly 50,000 phones, to Pacific Telemanagement Services, an independent operator founded in 1986. What had been part of the American telephone system became the inventory of a private company in California. None of that was an accident, and none of it was a mystery. There was no meeting where somebody decided to take the payphones away from the public. There was something plainer and colder than that. Once the subsidy was gone by statute, and once the calls stopped coming, the payphone stopped paying for itself, and every party with the power to keep it standing decided not to. Congress deregulated it on purpose. The Commission priced it at market on purpose. The carriers sold it off on purpose. The cities pulled it out on purpose. Nobody killed the payphone. Everybody declined to save it, in writing, with dates. The collapse from there is documented in the government's own filings. By 2013, the FCC reported the number of payphones in service had fallen more than 90% from the peak. In 2012, the Commission counted 243,487 payphones still standing, generating about $362 million. By 2015, that revenue had fallen to $286 million. Fewer than 100,000 payphones remained in service at the end of 2016. In February of 2018, the Commission eliminated the payphone call tracking audit rules altogether. On the reasoning that payphone use had declined so far, the rules no longer served any purpose. The regulators stopped counting. New York City wrote the ending in public. The city's payphone franchise expired in October of 2014. On November 17th of that year, the de Blasio administration announced Link NYC, a plan to replace the roughly 9,000 to 13,000 remaining payphones with internet kiosks built by a consortium called CityBridge, which committed to installing 7,500 of them within a decade. The first kiosks went in during late 2015. 7 years later, the crane came for the last phone on 7th Avenue. The replacement did not hold up its end. In July of 2021, the New York State Comptroller published an audit of the program. By May of 2020, CityBridge had installed 1,869 of the 3,153 kiosks it owed the city, and 50 of those had never been switched on. The kiosks reached 86 of the city's 185 zip codes. As of March 2020, the city was owed roughly $68.9 million in advertising revenue and interest, plus about $2.6 million in damages for kiosks that did not work. Of 227 units the auditors inspected, 172 had cleanliness or operating problems. The payphone was removed on schedule. The thing meant to replace it was not. Which brings all of this to the device in your pocket right now. It is a better telephone than the payphone ever was in almost every measurable way, and it fails in exactly the way the payphone never did. It fails when the battery dies, when the tower is overloaded, when the account lapses, and when you do not have one. Some of the network is still standing. Pacific Telemanagement Services is still the largest payphone operator in the country and still runs thousands of phones across dozens of states. A working payphone is reported inside the Union Square subway station in Manhattan, and 4 full-length enclosed booths are reported still standing on West End Avenue on the Upper West Side, kept now as landmarks rather than utilities. Prisons and rural highway pull-offs still have coin phones because the alternative does not reach that far. The engineering survived too, in a place almost nobody thinks to look. The copper local loop still carries its own power from the central office, and a plain corded telephone plugged into a copper line still works during a blackout for the same reason the payphone did. Every emergency call box on a highway shoulder runs the same basic idea: a device that needs no owner, no charge and no subscription, sitting on a line waiting for somebody who has run out of options. And in the last few years, a handful of small towns, among them Tunbridge, Vermont, have put in free public phones on their own, paid for locally, because they decided the gap left behind was real. Here is the spine of it. A Hartford mechanic built a lockbox in 1889 that let anybody borrow a telephone for a coin. The American phone system carried that promise for a century on somebody else's money. When the law required it to stand on its own, it could not, and no one with the authority to intervene chose to. What the country had was a communications network of last resort that did not care who you were, what you earned, or whether anyone knew your name. What it has now is a network that works better and asks more questions. Both of those things are true at once, and only one of them is out on the sidewalk. The technology never failed. The arrangement that paid for it ended, and nothing was built to do the specific job it had been doing. There is still copper in the ground, and the question is still open. When the towers are down and the battery is dead, what is a person supposed to use?